You want a tip? Say it in Arabic. Though I doubt you even understand it. The words didn't just hang in the air. They cut through the soft clink of crystal glasses and the low hum of a live jazz trio like a blade wrapped in silk, subtle but unmistakably sharp, and for a brief second, the entire private dining room at the Crescent Room seemed to pause, not in shock but in expectation, because this was the kind of room where power performed, where men like Daniel Whitmore didn't just speak, they set the tone, and everyone else adjusted accordingly. Daniel sat at the center of a polished mahogany table that could seat 12 but tonight held only 6, a deliberate choice, intimacy disguised as exclusivity. His tailored charcoal suit fit like a second skin, his silver watch catching the amber light every time his hand moved, which was often, because Daniel Whitmore was a man who filled space with gestures, with presence, with the quiet confidence of someone who had never been told no in a way that mattered. Across from him sat 2 investors from overseas, their expressions polite but calculating, while to his right, a junior executive nodded a little too eagerly at everything Daniel said, laughter arriving half a second too late, and just behind them, almost invisible unless you were looking, stood Naomi Carter, her posture straight, her uniform crisp, her movements precise enough to disappear into the rhythm of service. She had been on her feet for 6 hours already, balancing trays, refilling glasses, clearing plates before anyone noticed they were empty, the kind of efficiency that rarely earned praise but always prevented complaints. And yet in a room like this, her presence was not defined by what she did, but by what people assumed she couldn't do. Daniel didn't look at her when he spoke, not really. His eyes skimmed past her like she was part of the furniture, and when he repeated the phrase in Arabic, slower this time, his tone shifted just enough to invite amusement, the kind of amusement that lived in raised eyebrows and suppressed smiles. Maybe this will make it clearer, he added, leaning back slightly, confident, relaxed, entirely certain of his control over the moment. A quiet chuckle rippled around the table, not loud enough to be offensive, but just enough to confirm the hierarchy. Naomi didn't react. Not outwardly, her hands remained steady as she poured a glass of sparkling water, the liquid catching the light as it filled the crystal flute, but something in her eyes sharpened, not anger, not embarrassment, something quieter, something more deliberate, like a door closing softly before another one opened, because what no one in that room understood, what Daniel Whitmore couldn't possibly have calculated into his performance, was that silence was not always submission, sometimes it was preparation, sometimes it was observation, and sometimes it was power waiting for the exact right moment to speak. Naomi set the glass down without a sound, the base touching the table with a precision that came from repetition, not hesitation, and for a moment she let the silence stretch just long enough to feel intentional, not awkward, because in rooms like this, silence could either shrink you or elevate you depending on how you carried it. Daniel did not notice the shift at first. He was too busy watching the reaction of his guests, measuring their amusement like a man checking numbers on a screen. Always calculating, always adjusting, he assumed the moment belonged to him, that the rhythm of the evening would continue exactly as he dictated. But Naomi was no longer moving at the same invisible pace. Her posture changed in a way that was almost imperceptible, her shoulders relaxed instead of tightened, her gaze lifted just slightly, not enough to challenge but enough to exist, and when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, clear, and entirely unhurried as she answered him in Arabic, not just repeating his words but correcting them with a subtle precision that only someone fluent would catch, the tone respectful, the grammar flawless, the meaning unmistakably sharper than what he had intended. It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it landed with the kind of weight that did not need volume to be felt. The table froze in a different way this time, not with expectation but with recognition. One of the investors blinked, then leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from polite interest to something closer to curiosity. The junior executive stopped smiling altogether, caught between confusion and realization, and Daniel, for the first time that evening, did not move immediately. His hand paused mid-gesture, his confidence interrupted not by confrontation, but by something far more unsettling, uncertainty, because he understood just enough Arabic to recognize that what she said was not a simple reply, it was a correction, and not just of language but of assumption. Naomi did not rush to fill the silence after that. She did not explain herself, she simply stood there, composed, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if responding fluently to a language meant to exclude her was just another part of her job. And that was the moment the balance in the room began to shift, quietly, almost invisibly, like the first crack In glass that no one notices until it spreads, one of the investors spoke then, also in Arabic, testing, probing, his tone lighter but his eyes focused, and Naomi responded again without hesitation, this time with a slight nuance that carried both professionalism and confidence, answering his question while subtly clarifying a point that Daniel had misstated earlier in the conversation, a detail about regional distribution that had gone unnoticed until now, the kind of detail that did not just reveal language skills but understanding, and that was when the room changed completely because this was no longer about a waitress who surprised them, this was about information, accuracy and credibility, and Daniel Whitmore, the man who built his reputation on control, was suddenly sitting in a room where he was no longer the most informed person at the table. He leaned back slowly, masking the shift with a measured breath, but the performance had cracked just enough for everyone to see that the power he carried so effortlessly moments ago was not as absolute as it seemed, and Naomi, still standing with nothing but a tray in her hand, had not raised her voice, had not stepped out of line, had not broken a single rule, and yet she had just redrawn the entire hierarchy of the room without asking for permission. The air did not recover, it shifted, and the difference was subtle but irreversible, like a room that had been carefully arranged suddenly revealing a flaw no one could unsee. Daniel Whitmore felt it before he fully understood it, the way conversation slowed just slightly, the way attention no longer orbited him with the same automatic gravity, and for a man who built his empire on control, even a small fracture in perception was unacceptable. He adjusted his cuff as if resetting the moment, his voice returning with practiced calm, but there was a tighter edge beneath it now, a precision that was no longer effortless but deliberate. He responded in English this time, redirecting the conversation back to numbers, projections, timelines, the language he trusted, the language that had always secured him dominance, yet something had already slipped beyond recovery. One of the investors, Mr. Khalid, did not follow his lead immediately. Instead he glanced toward Naomi again, not dismissively, not casually, but with interest, the kind reserved for someone who had just revealed unexpected value. And then he asked another question in Arabic, more complex this time, layered with industry nuance, a question that was not meant for entertainment but for verification. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second, not long enough for most to notice but long enough to matter because hesitation in rooms like this was louder than any mistake. Naomi answered again, her tone steady, her phrasing precise. But this time there was something more, not just fluency but clarity. She broke down the concept in a way that made the implications obvious, not only addressing the question but subtly exposing a flaw in Daniel's earlier explanation. Not aggressively, not disrespectfully, but undeniably, the kind of correction that did not challenge authority directly but made it impossible to ignore. The junior executive shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence replaced with a quiet unease, because the script had changed and no one had announced it. Daniel leaned forward slightly, reclaiming physical space as if that could restore balance, but presence without credibility is just posture, and for the first time that evening, his words required effort to land. He spoke faster, adding details, reinforcing his position, yet the rhythm was off, like a musician missing the beat by just enough to be felt but not easily explained. Naomi, meanwhile, stepped back into stillness, her role visually unchanged, a server holding a tray, but the perception of her had transformed completely. She was no longer invisible, she was a variable, and in high-stakes conversations variables demand attention. Mr. Khalid exchanged a brief look with his colleague, a silent communication that carried more weight than any spoken agreement, because deals are not only built on numbers, they are built on confidence, and confidence had just shifted directions. Daniel sensed it now, fully, the realization settling in with a quiet heaviness, not panic, not yet, but awareness, the kind that forces recalculation, and as the conversation continued, it became clear that the room was no longer following him, it was evaluating him, and Naomi Carter, who had entered the evening as background, had become the reference point no one had planned for. She did not interrupt again, she did not seek attention, she simply existed with a calm certainty that made everything else sharper, clearer, more honest, and in that clarity Daniel Whitmore faced something unfamiliar, not opposition, not competition, but exposure, the kind that does not need confrontation to dismantle authority. It only needs truth placed in the right moment, in the right language, spoken by the one person he never thought to consider. By the time the main course arrived, the room had split into two invisible halves, not by seating but by perception, those who still followed Daniel out of habit and those who had begun to question him without saying a word. The difference was quiet but unmistakable, like a current shifting beneath still water. Daniel felt it in the pauses between responses, in the way Mr. Khalid no longer nodded immediately, in the way his colleague now asked questions that required precision instead of performance, and Daniel adjusted the only way he knew how, by doubling down. He leaned forward, his voice measured, confident, carefully paced as he began outlining a revised projection, adding figures, percentages, quarterly timelines, the language of control returning to his tone as if numbers alone could rebuild authority. But numbers, when built on shaky ground, do not stabilize a room, they expose it. And Mr. Khalid listened, not interrupting, not reacting, simply absorbing, his expression unreadable, until he placed his glass down and asked a single question, again in Arabic, slower this time, deliberate, a question about regional compliance and regulatory timing that cut directly into the structure Daniel had just presented. It was not a trick question, it was a real one, and that made it far more dangerous. Daniel understood enough to recognize the topic, but not enough to answer with certainty, and certainty was everything in this room. He hesitated just briefly, then began to respond in English, pivoting, reframing, buying time, but the shift was visible now, unmistakable, because for the first time that evening he was no longer speaking from mastery, he was speaking from recovery, and before the gap could widen, Naomi stepped in, not forward, not interrupting, but aligning herself just within earshot as she refilled a glass, and in the same calm, even tone she had used before, she answered the question in Arabic, not only addressing the compliance issue but clarifying the timeline with a level of detail that suggested not just familiarity, but experience. She referenced regional rollout standards, licensing delays, and distribution sequencing with a clarity that removed all ambiguity, and when she finished, she returned to stillness as if nothing had happened, as if she had simply poured water, and that was the moment the room settled into a new truth. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Mr. Khalid nodded slowly, not at Daniel, but at the answer itself, the kind of nod that signals alignment, and then he spoke, this time in English, his tone polite but firm, asking Daniel to confirm the timeline Naomi had just outlined, not as a suggestion, but as a requirement. And Daniel, for a fraction of a second, looked at her, really looked at her, not as staff, not as background, but as the source of the standard he was now expected to meet. And in that glance was something unfamiliar, not anger, not yet, but recognition, the realization that the person he had dismissed minutes ago had just become the benchmark for his credibility. He straightened slightly, recalibrating, repeating the timeline with careful agreement, but the weight of it had changed because now it was no longer his idea leading the room, it was his agreement following hers, and that subtle reversal carried more impact than any confrontation could have. The junior executive lowered his gaze, understanding what had just occurred even if no one said it out loud, and Naomi remained exactly where she was, composed, precise, present, not seeking acknowledgement, not claiming anything, because she did not need to. The room had already adjusted around her, and Daniel Whitmore, a man who had spent years mastering every room he entered, was now sitting in one that no longer belonged to him, not because he had lost power in a dramatic way, but because someone else had introduced something stronger than power, something quieter, something harder to control, the simple, undeniable presence of truth delivered at exactly the right moment. The conversation did not end, it tightened like a thread being pulled. Slowly but firmly until every loose assumption began to unravel, Daniel Whitmore continued speaking, but now every word carried the quiet pressure of verification, no longer accepted at face value, no longer insulated by his title or his presence. He spoke of expansion, of strategic partnerships, of projected growth across regions measured in miles and markets, but the room was no longer listening the same way. They were listening through a new filter, one that had been introduced without announcement, one that compared what was said to what had already been clarified, and that difference, however slight, was enough to shift confidence. Mr. Khalid leaned back slightly, his fingers resting against the edge of the table, his gaze thoughtful, not impressed, not dismissive, simply weighing. And then he asked another question, this time in English, but the structure of it carried the same precision. He referenced a clause, a detail buried deep in the agreement draft, something minor to anyone unprepared, but critical to anyone paying attention. Daniel responded quickly, too quickly, offering a general explanation, broad, polished, the kind that had carried him through countless negotiations, but the answer lacked the one thing the room now required, specificity, and that absence did not go unnoticed. A brief silence followed, not uncomfortable but deliberate, and in that silence, Naomi moved again, not stepping forward, not interrupting, simply placing a plate, adjusting a glass, positioning herself within the flow of service. And then in the same calm tone that had already reshaped the evening, she spoke, clarifying the clause with exact language, referencing the implication it had on delivery timelines and regional accountability. Her explanation did not contradict Daniel directly, it refined him. It narrowed the space between assumption and accuracy until there was no room left for interpretation. And that was when the final shift occurred, not loud, not dramatic but absolute. Mr. Khalid nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried decision, and he turned his attention fully to Daniel, not as someone leading the conversation, but as someone now being assessed within it. "We value precision," he said calmly, his voice steady, professional, but firm in a way that did not require emphasis. "And clarity builds trust." The words were simple, but their placement was exact, and Daniel understood them immediately, not as advice but as evaluation. He straightened slightly, his expression composed, but beneath that composure was a recalculation happening in real time, because he could feel it now. The deal was no longer secured by momentum, it was being rebuilt moment by moment, detail by detail, and he was no longer the only one shaping it. Naomi stepped back once more, returning to the quiet rhythm of service, but the room did not forget her presence. It adjusted around it. Every statement now carried the silent question of whether it would hold under her clarity, whether it would align with the standard she had set without ever claiming it. And Daniel Whitmore, a man who had built his reputation on commanding rooms, found himself in a position he had never prepared for, not losing control in a dramatic fall, but watching it shift inch by inch toward someone he had never considered a factor. And the most unsettling part was not that she had spoken, it was that she had been right, consistently, effortlessly, and without seeking recognition, because in a room built on power, the most dangerous thing is not opposition, it is quiet accuracy, the kind that does not argue, does not demand, but simply reveals, and once revealed, cannot be ignored. By the time dessert menus were quietly placed on the table, the energy in the room had transformed into something far more measured, far more careful, like a high-stakes game where every move was now deliberate and observed. Daniel Whitmore no longer spoke to impress, he spoke to stabilize, choosing his words with precision instead of momentum. But the shift had already taken root, and once perception changes, it does not easily return to what it was. Mr. Khalid closed the leather folder in front of him with a soft but decisive motion, the kind that signals a pause not just in conversation, but in evaluation. His colleague mirrored the gesture, and the junior executive, who had once leaned forward eagerly, now sat back, quiet, aware that something larger than numbers had just been decided beneath the surface. Daniel noticed it immediately, the subtle choreography of hesitation, the absence of that final nod that usually sealed everything. And for the first time that evening he chose to address it directly, his voice calm, composed, but carrying a careful edge. He asked if there were any remaining concerns, any final clarifications needed before they moved forward. It was the kind of question that usually invited reassurance, but tonight it invited honesty. Mr. Khalid looked at him for a moment, not with hostility, not with doubt, but with clarity, and then he spoke, his tone respectful but firm, explaining that while the opportunity remained strong, confidence required alignment, and alignment required precision, not just in data, but in understanding. He did not raise his voice. He did not criticize, but the message was unmistakable. This was no longer a conversation about potential, it was a decision about trust. Daniel listened, nodding slightly, maintaining composure, but inside, the realization settled fully. The deal was no longer his to close, it was his to recover, and recovery, unlike control, could not be forced, it had to be earned. Naomi stood at the edge of the table, still, composed, her presence unchanged in position but entirely transformed in meaning. She was no longer just part of the service, she had become part of the standard, and everyone in the room understood it. Even if no one said it out loud, Daniel glanced at her again, not dismissively this time, not even curiously but thoughtfully, as if recalculating everything he had overlooked in the span of a single evening. Because what had happened here was not loud, not dramatic, but it was undeniable. The foundation of authority had shifted, not through confrontation but through consistency, not through challenge but through clarity. Mr. Khalid stood slowly, signaling the end of the meeting. His handshake with Daniel was polite, professional, but lighter than expected, the kind that leaves space instead of sealing agreement. And as he turned to leave, He paused for a brief moment, his gaze moving toward Naomi, offering a small nod of acknowledgement, not exaggerated, not performative but genuine, the kind of recognition that cannot be bought or demanded, only earned, and then he walked away, leaving behind a room that was quieter than before, not empty, but reflective. Daniel remained standing for a moment, his hand resting against the back of his chair, the weight of the evening settling in, not as failure but as revelation, because for the first time in a long time, he had encountered something his usual strategies could not control, something that did not respond to status or pressure, something that simply existed and in existing redefined everything around it. And Naomi Carter, who had entered the room unseen, had done exactly that without raising her voice, without stepping out of place, without asking for anything at all. She had changed the outcome of the night by being precisely who she was, and in doing so, she had introduced a truth Daniel Whitmore could not ignore, that power built on perception can shift in an instant, but respect built on substance does not need to move at all to be felt. The room did not empty all at once, it dissolved, one quiet step at a time, chairs sliding back, soft goodbyes exchanged, the low hum of professionalism masking what everyone had already understood, that something significant had shifted and no one needed to announce it. Daniel Whitmore remained near the table a moment longer than necessary, his posture still composed but no longer commanding, the absence of attention around him more noticeable than any presence had been earlier. The junior executive gathered his notes quickly, avoiding eye contact, offering a polite nod before stepping out, leaving Daniel alone with the echo of a conversation that had not ended the way he expected. Across the room, Naomi Carter continued her work, clearing plates, stacking silverware with the same precision she had shown all night, her movements unchanged, her rhythm steady, as if the outcome of a multi-million-dollar negotiation had nothing to do with her at all. And in a way, it did not. Because she had not entered the room to influence it, she had simply refused to diminish herself within it. Daniel watched her for a moment, longer than before, not with irritation, not with confusion, but with a kind of reluctant clarity, the kind that arrives when denial is no longer an option. He took a step forward, then another, the polished floor reflecting the overhead light in quiet patterns beneath his shoes, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than it had been all evening. Stripped of performance, "You speak Arabic fluently," he said, not as a question but as an acknowledgement. Naomi looked up, meeting his gaze briefly, not challenging, not deferential, simply present. "Yes, I do," she replied, her tone even respectful but grounded in something deeper than politeness, something closer to certainty. Daniel nodded slightly, absorbing that answer in a way that went beyond language, because what he was processing now was not just her skill, but his assumption. The gap between what he believed and what was real, and how easily that gap had cost him control of the room. He exhaled slowly, a small breath that carried more weight than any of his earlier words. "I underestimated you," he said, the sentence simple, direct, and unfamiliar on his tongue, because men like Daniel Whitmore did not build their lives on admitting oversight. Naomi did not react dramatically. She did not soften or harden, she simply listened, her expression calm, because for her, this moment was not about validation, it was about truth finally being spoken out loud. "You did not know me," she answered, her voice steady, not defensive, not forgiving, just accurate, and that distinction mattered. Daniel held her gaze for a second longer, recognizing the difference, understanding that this was not a moment he could control or reshape. It was one he had to accept as it was, unpolished, unframed, real. The restaurant lights dimmed slightly as the evening moved toward closing. The outside city glowing faintly through the tall windows, miles of quiet streets stretching beyond the glass, and in that reflection, Daniel saw something he had not noticed before. Not her uniform, not her role, but her presence, steady, unshaken, independent of the room that had tried to define her. He nodded once more, not as a gesture of authority but of recognition, and then he turned, walking toward the exit with a pace that was slower, more measured than when he had arrived, because the man who had entered that room expecting to control it had left with something else entirely, a realization that power could command attention, but it could not replace substance, and that the person he had dismissed without a second thought had not just spoken a language he failed to respect, she had revealed a truth he could no longer ignore. The restaurant lights dimmed further as the last of the guests disappeared into the night, leaving behind a space that felt larger, quieter, almost honest now that the performance was over. The polished tables no longer reflected power, only what remained after it, Naomi Carter moved through the room with the same steady rhythm, collecting the final glasses, aligning silverware, resetting the space for a new day that would arrive whether tonight had mattered or not, because for her this was never about one room, one table, or one man. It was about something much older, something learned long before she ever stepped into a place like this, something that had nothing to do with titles or wealth. Across the room, one of the restaurant managers approached her briefly, offering a quick nod, a quiet acknowledgement that carried more weight than words, not because of what had happened, but because of how she had handled it, composed, precise, unshaken. Naomi returned the nod and continued working, because recognition, when it comes without demand, does not require celebration. It simply settles where it belongs, outside. The city stretched for miles, streets lined with quiet movement, headlights passing like distant thoughts, the world continuing exactly as it always does, unaware that inside a private dining room, a shift had occurred that would not make headlines but would be remembered by those who witnessed it. Daniel Whitmore stepped out onto the sidewalk, the cool night air meeting him with a stillness that felt different from the controlled environment he had just left. He paused for a moment, looking out across the street, the glow of the city reflecting off glass buildings, and for the first time that evening there was no one to perform for, no one to impress, no one to outmaneuver, just space, and in that space clarity has a way of arriving without permission. He replayed the conversation, not the parts where he spoke, but the moments where he lost control without realizing it, the pauses, the corrections, the quiet shifts that had dismantled his certainty piece by piece. And at the center of all of it was someone he had dismissed in a single sentence, not because of who she was, but because of what he assumed she could not be. He exhaled slowly, the weight of that realization settling deeper than any financial loss could have, because deals can be renegotiated, but perception, once broken, demands something else entirely. Across the glass behind him, he caught a faint reflection of the dining room, Naomi still moving inside, still working, unchanged by the outcome in a way that made everything clearer. She had not needed the room to validate her, she had brought her value with her, and that difference was what made her untouchable in a way he had never considered. Daniel adjusted his jacket, not out of habit this time but as if resetting himself, not the version of him that entered the room, but the one leaving it, quieter, more aware. And as he stepped forward into the night, there was no dramatic conclusion, no sudden transformation, just a single undeniable truth that would follow him long after the evening ended, that power can fill a room, but it is clarity that defines it, and on a night built for control, it was not the loudest voice or the richest man who shaped the outcome, it was the one person who never needed to prove anything to begin with. The next morning did not announce itself with anything dramatic, no headlines, no urgent calls, no immediate consequences that could be measured in dollars or headlines, but the shift from the night before lingered in quieter ways, the kind that do not fade with sleep. Daniel Whitmore sat in his office high above the city, glass walls stretching from floor to ceiling, offering a view that usually reinforced his sense of control, miles of buildings, movement, decisions, all within reach, or so it had always seemed. His desk was organized, his schedule full, meetings lined up with precision. But there was a difference now, not in the world around him, but in how he saw it, because once perspective changes, it does not return to its original form. He replayed the moment again, not the words he had spoken, but the ones he had missed, the subtle corrections, the quiet authority that had emerged from someone he never thought to acknowledge. And for a man who had built his success on reading people, predicting outcomes, and controlling narratives, that realization carried more weight than any missed deal ever could. Across the city, Naomi Carter walked into her morning class, a small lecture hall with rows of worn desks and soft overhead lighting, a notebook in her hand, her posture the same as it had been the night before, steady, composed, focused. She took her seat without drawing attention, blending into the rhythm of students arriving, conversations starting, professors preparing to speak, because in this space, just like the restaurant, she did not need recognition to know her worth. She had spent years building it, quietly, consistently, in ways no one had applauded, learning languages, understanding systems, observing how power moved and how easily it overlooked what it did not expect. And that was the difference. She did not wait for rooms to accept her. She entered them already prepared, already certain, already complete. Back in his office, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his reflection faintly visible in the glass behind his desk, not the reflection of a man in control, but of someone who had just encountered a truth he could not negotiate away. He understood now that what happened last night was not an isolated moment, it was a pattern he had ignored, a blind spot he had carried into Every room without consequence until now. And the cost of that blind spot was not just one deal, it was credibility, trust, the very foundation he relied on to lead. He reached for his phone, paused, then set it back down because this was not something that could be fixed with a call or a strategy. It required something far less familiar: awareness, humility, adjustment, the kind that does not happen in public, but in the quiet decisions that follow. Naomi, meanwhile, listened as her professor began the lecture, her attention steady, her pen moving across the page, capturing ideas, refining understanding, continuing forward without pause, because for her the night before was not a victory, it was simply alignment, a moment where who she was met a space that needed it, nothing more, nothing less. And that is what made it powerful, not the reaction, not the recognition, but the consistency, the fact that she would be the same person in every room whether anyone noticed or not. And that is where the story settles, not in the loss of a deal or the rise of a single moment, but in the quiet truth that remains after everything else fades, that power can command attention, it can shape rooms, it can influence outcomes, but it cannot replace substance, and when substance finally speaks, it does not need volume. It does not need permission, it simply changes everything, because in the end, the room was never his to own, it was hers to redefine. And she did it without ever asking for it.